Welcome back to the Producer Podcast. I'm your host, Micah Gerber, and today we're going to conclude our conversation with Micah Gerber on financing your film, as well as hear from Micah about what he wishes he knew back when he first got started as a filmmaker. So without further ado, let's get started. One question I'd have, kind of branching off of like building those relationships before you go and like ask somebody for money. I know people where it's like they don't have the money, but they have friends that have that money. So like, how are ways where, I mean, you're not just doing it to try and get the money. You want to obviously build real relationship, but that you can like get them to like make an introduction or kind of start building that relationship early on.
Yeah, I think a great example of that network of people know people who know people is with schools. So like okay. Christian schools and public schools, anybody who does donor style, by the way, schools are the greatest way to learn about funding ever because schools do so much of it and they do large amounts of money. But schools are a unique thing because schools have a donor board usually, or a board of directors. It can be a donor board, it can be a board of directors, it can be a mixed bag of things. But that board is usually put in place because they know people who have money. Yeah. And because they gave a large gift. So let's say they gave $2 million. They probably know somebody who can give $2 million.
Yep.
And so how do you build that relationship? Well, you probably can't have a team of 12 funding executives on your feature film. That's probably not plausible. If it is, I'm proud of you. I hope your company is successful. But for the most part, normal people have like no one. It's the producer doing it. If you're fortunate to have an engagement officer for your company, that's excellent. You're going to be far more successful in getting funding because you're able to pay somebody and that's their job to make network connections in that area. But I think, again, we talked about engagement and the idea of relationship. And because you have a relationship with somebody, you want to make sure that relationship is close. So let's say an uncle. Okay. Let's say my uncle knows someone who has a lot of money. And he comments to me one day, he's like, hey, you should talk to Fred. He's got boats of money. And he's trying to find somebody to invest in. He's always looking for somebody to invest in. And so I say, okay, can we, how do I get in touch with Fred? I'll just call him. I'm like, okay. So I could cold call him, and that might be a reasonable option. It also depends on the age of the person. So, if somebody's in the 70 to 80 range right now, and they have a lot of money, they're going to be more comfortable with a cold call than someone who's 30 to 40 and has a ton of money.
All right.
That's kind of a weird balance. I usually find email introductions to be very helpful, or dinner invitations. So if you can say, hey, let's say Tom, Uncle Tom, can we go out to dinner and can you invite Fred? And that's a great moment to build a relationship. All of a sudden, you're both in the same space, you're buying dinner, so you're making an investment in them, and then you just kind of build this thing up, and then eventually your Uncle Tom's going to do half the work anyway, because Uncle Tom's going to be like, hey, by the way, Micah's making a feature film. Maybe, just maybe, Fred, you could give money to him. And then you've got to work through the awkwardness of that statement and then kind of work through, okay, yeah, actually I am making one. Would you like to talk about it?
Mm-hmm.
And either Fred will be really weirded out by you and just be like, okay, no, which he would have been anyway.
Yes.
Or you just built a successful connection and your network has increased. So a great example is I knew somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody. Mm-hmm. So I knew Ken Carpenter, kind of. We're not tight, but I kind of knew Ken Carpenter. And Ken Carpenter produced a film called Run the Race.
Yes.
Great movie. I was at a job fair walking around making network connections. And all of a sudden I saw this poster for Run the Race. And I'm like, well, that's really cool. So I walked up and I was like, so were you guys part of Run the Race? And they were like, yeah, we funded part of the budget for it. And I was like, really? That's really cool. Can I get your email address? I know, I've had chats with Ken before and, it's been really great, to connect. And, I'd love to, I do film. I want to, eventually produce film. So I'd love to keep you in my network. And because I knew I had a relationship with Ken to a level,
yeah,
I had a level of credibility with them and was able to step into that and have at least an email conversation with them about stuff. I wasn't ready to produce a project at that moment, so they obviously didn't fund things for me, but maybe eventually I'll be able to pull that. That's another thing, though, that plays into a factor. So friend of a friend of a friend, right? One of the biggest questions I always get asked as a funding consultant is I walk into the conversation and they're like, so, to prove your credibility, can you give us a list of names of people that have invested, so that we can contact them? Apart from being illegal, I don't do that. And that's something that you can it won't be effective for you anyway. So even if I kept a collection of people, let's say I kept a list of 100 names of people that I knew, the only person that would be effective for is me. Because the only person they know is me. And so they might keep a level of credibility because I recommended someone. And I'm probably not going to recommend someone because it's just a bad name on me if they're, hard to work with or whatever. But it's never as simple as a list of names, if that makes sense. That's why funding's a long process, and normally to get a film off the ground, right, it's like, oftentimes a 2-year process. It's because a bunch of people are building relationships, and it's like, I don't know, they talk about dating taking, 2 years to really solidify and understand the relationship kind of deal. So that you got the rose-colored glasses off. It's a little bit like that with funding. Like, you're just going through this process of taking people out to dinner until somebody's like, yeah, 2.5 million's nothing. I got you. Can you actually give me 2.5 million back? Okay, we'll talk about it. We'll make sure you're successful. I'll give you advice. I'll work you through this. And that's the kind of people you want behind you. People who want to give you advice.
Yes.
Wise people. And those people might not be Christians. Because there are some really savvy business people who have been blessed by the Lord tremendously. Because God allows kingdoms to be built and torn down. And so any blessing of financial or whatever is ultimately God's either blessing something that they're doing to make his name glorified.
Right. So
there's this aspect of they've got money. They're willing to give it to you. They might not have the same kingdom mindset as you, but they have a business mindset, and if they're even considering working with you as an investor in a faith-based film, they must not be completely opposed to it, and who knows, that person might come to know the Lord because of it, and that would be a great opportunity. So That's my 2 cents on that.
This is something I think it's more noticeable when it comes to like crowdfunding, but I think even when you're going like the investor route, it's still important. But how do you help keep those people involved with the process, so it's not just like they give you the check and then they don't hear anything from you until the film is done? You know, what are things you can do so that they feel involved in the process, like that they know what's going on and stuff like that?
That's a good question. So your comment of it being more of a thing in crowdfunding is actually, so it's actually funny. It's actually very much so that in the investor world, donor world, everyone wants to know.
Okay.
The reason being is everyone believes they're part of your team. So an investor, a donor, a crowdfunding person, they believe they're as important to your film as a grip, or as an electric, or as the DP, or as the director. Maybe not as the director. Maybe they think he's cooler than they are. But for the most part, they think they are part of your team. And so what would you tell your director? How would you keep your director up to date with how the production's going? How would you keep a key grip up to date with how the film's going in post-production, in production? You know, what are you commenting? What do they want to see? I think it's funny. Some of the things that I've gotten most comments on when I've been on a feature film. So I've been on a feature film, right? And I'll post like a Facebook Live or something. Not a Facebook Live, a Facebook story or something like that.
Okay.
And it's funny the things I get comments on, because like one post I'm like, oh, I'm going to get lots of comments on this. And I get like nothing. And then I'll post something else and everybody's like all up, oh, this is so cool. This is amazing. And I'm like, guys, it's mini golf with a grip arm. Like, what the heck? You know, like it was way more important. The spiritual thing was way more important. How I was talking to, you know, I posted about a mask that I wear from CWVFF and how that, you know, can have a great gospel opportunity. And I got more comments about the mini golf thing with a tennis ball and a grip arm than I did about that. And I'm like, okay, guys, let's get our minds straight here. But that's how social media works. Okay, so I get it.
Yes.
But it's what people want to hear, right? And so what do they want to hear about set? They want to hear funny things from set, but they also want to hear things that are relatable to them. And so really, I think for the most part, even with crowdfunding, people don't really give what people don't give what you want to hear. People want to hear that you're having fun, that you're getting your work done, and that the movie's coming along.
Right.
And so even behind the scenes shots, like I've seen some behind the scenes things where it's like a 5-minute video. And I'm like, okay, no one cares that much. Like even as a person who's been a part of the crew, I'll like watch the first 30 seconds and be like, I remember that moment. That was a good time. And then I move on. It's just like any social media. It's staying in touch there. If you only have email, because that's a thing. Sometimes you have an older audience and they only have email, right? So how can you keep them engaged? Well, sometimes they only have dial-up internet. So I had somebody like complain tremendously that we were only doing updates in videos. They wanted a written out explanation of what was going on. Basically, they wanted the video in text. And so I had to transition from doing videos to doing a video at the top, and then I went through a transcription thing and just transcribed it out as an email. Exactly what I talked about in the video. Transcribed it as an email so that I would satisfy part of my audience. And it's just understanding who that is. And sometimes you won't, because if you have like 3,000 people following you, you're not going to be able to... unless they tell you, like, specifically, like, hey, I like written text, which is what this person did. It is what it is. But, like, unless they tell you, you're not really going to know. You're just going to assume that it's being effective. The other thing is that your people that are giving money to you should be your biggest fans. Same with your crew. They shouldn't hate you. And so if they don't have anything coming to them, they can't share it. So, like, your updates are the way that people let other people know about you. What are things that you would want to share? So let's say you record a video. Let's say we record a video like this, where we're kind of doing a talking head kind of deal. We're both on Zoom, and we kind of do a shared Zoom call, and we talk about the film. And let's say we talk about it for 5 minutes. All right. Are you likely to share that with somebody on social media? Personally, I don't. I wouldn't share something like that. That's just my personal thing. Maybe other people would. But for the most part, I'm not sharing things like that regularly on social media. I'm sharing things like memes. I'm sharing short 30-second funny things or things that I felt were super, super valuable. And so if someone posts something and I see it, and I'm like, okay, I'll watch it. But if it's not super, like, quick engaging, I'm not going to share it for the most part. And that's just a social media issue on my end. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe I'm just not, I'm just not as willing to share it as I should be.
I'm weird in my own ways on what I share on social media.
But it's one of those things where it's like, okay, so can you create a piece of content that is shareable outside of just the film? So people may be as sold as they want to be on the film, and they believe that film is going to be the most successful thing in the world. But if you're sending them a bunch of content, updating them, that looks like complete trash and or is just boring, they're going to be ashamed to share that. And so if you don't have the equipment, right, to really make a stunning looking piece of, and stunning maybe is a really engaging piece, and do that frequently, figure out how to do short things, memes. I forget who it is. There's somebody that does that super regularly, where they're like, comment with a description of this. Maybe it's you, actually. I don't know. Somebody does that where they put out like photos and say comment.
Yeah.
Is that you?
I've done that some in the past. I know The Chosen. I think that's something they've been doing more recently as well.
I think stuff like that's really effective because it's engaging an audience. Now, it's not a shareable piece, but it is engaging an audience, and you're getting a tangible reply to something. One of the films I was on was called Mayberry Man, and they had this guy that looks like Don Knotts. I mean, the guy is convincing. And I got a lot of response to people when I would take a photo with him and say, hanging out with Barn, because it was, it had this character of Barney in it. And everybody was like, wait, that looks just like Don Knotts. Don Knotts is dead, though. Like, how does that work? And so there's this weird kid, but every film has that kind of stuff. Maybe not Don Knotts, but they have something. They have something that's really amazing. Somebody who's just like, absolutely ripped, whatever it is. Like, they're just this total bodybuilder. Or I watched Selfie Dad the other day. And Michael Jr. is just funny as a person. And so how do you take advantage of this actor who's just really funny? I was on a feature film recently, and one of the guys found this guitar in like a dumpster, bought some new pieces, fixed it up, and then would go around set playing it. He was one of the lead actors. And so it's like, how do you utilize this guy who's just making up songs on this busted up guitar from a trash can? How do you use that as engagement? And that's how you get your people who are supposed to be your biggest fans interested, is you're building a community.
Those are some really good thoughts on what to do and how to work with that engagement, because it definitely, I think, will affect how your film performs in the long run, for sure. So this next question, it's something that obviously no filmmaker likes to see happen, but sometimes, your funding campaign fails, whether it's a crowdfunder or maybe, you had to get enough investors by a certain date to either go into production when you wanted or to get other people to sign on to invest in it. So what would be like your advice on how to move forward if your funding campaign fails?
Yeah. So that brings back to a memory of a funding campaign that failed on my end. And I was very sad about it because I thought I wasn't supposed to produce the movie. And that's a really important question that you always run into is, should I produce this movie? Should I produce this movie?
Yes.
Should I produce this movie? And the answer to that is your why. It all comes down to that why, because if you have a why that you are convinced is going to be successful and people have gotten behind, it may just be that you're going down the wrong revenue stream.
Okay.
So, like in the case of Blindfolds, I started on crowdfunding, and the story was awesome. And I honestly thought I had a pretty convincing why. And people were behind it. Every time I talked with somebody, people were like, whoa, that is awesome. That's an awesome elevator pitch. That's an awesome, and I felt like I was doing everything right.
Mm-hmm.
And I did this crowdfunding campaign, and it totally failed. I mean, it failed. I think I had $100 the first day, and then it was pulling teeth. People would give $10, $10. And all I wanted was $1,000. That's how much I wanted to produce this movie. It wasn't a lot of money.
Yeah.
I'm like, man, can I just get one person who's willing to give $1,000 and call it a day, and I'll put him as an executive producer, and we're great. So I was pretty sad when that failed. I waited 30 whole days for that campaign to die. And at the end, I was just like, I don't know what to do. I can't afford to do this on my own. I have to have some money, to pay a colorist and things like that. And I just can't do this on my own. And so when I started out, my intention was that I was going to get a very experienced DP and a lot of higher level crew. It was still going to be a small crew, 6 or 8 people, but it was going to be higher level crew, more professional actors, things like that. And so I started out at a $10,000 budget. And that wasn't what the crowdfunding campaign was. I had already started kind of dwindling things down.
Yeah.
And I dwindled it down to, $1,000 to $2,000. And basically I was going to raise $1,000 with crowdfunding, and then I was going to figure out the other $1,000 later on distribution. That didn't work. So I had that crowdfunding campaign totally fail. I was down and out. I was like, I don't know what to do. And so I started talking with some people, and I was at college. So we talked about doing it as a film practicum, which was basically I got class credit for it.
Yeah.
And I was kind of like, but they're going to dictate who I can be with, who can help. And then I was like, wait, crew that are forced to work for me for a semester on this film? I'm like, that's actually a pretty good gig. It can be a learning experience for people. And basically I have like 4 people that are just forced to work with me for a semester. Which sometimes turned out one of them was my roommate, so that was helpful.
Okay.
But you know, it was a mixed bag of people who were super invested, who weren't super invested. All my actors ended up being. But I actually had I had to go like 3 tiers down in my actor chain to be able to get actors that were actually available, that were willing to work for free, spend an 8-hour day, 3 8-hour days shooting this film, that could get behind the vision, that looked correct for the role, all that stuff, all that producer stuff, right? And this whole time, I just started moving down the process of how do I figure out how to make this movie. But funding wasn't really something I was thinking about. I'm like, this campaign failed. I guess I'm just going to have to do it for free. And then this church hired me to do like a baptism video and paid me an exorbitant amount of money for what it was. And it was like $500. I say that for what it was an exorbitant amount of money. But like $500. I was like, so I'm halfway there. Halfway towards the budget I was looking at. Okay, so now we can actually do real production. We can do the production portion, because the other $500 was for marketing and distribution.
Yeah.
So I'm like, okay, so we can produce this. Because I needed some special props, because blindfolds, you're in this world where everyone's walking around with a blindfold on. I needed an engagement ring. I needed some batteries, things like that for gear, and XYZ. So I needed to buy some stuff. We needed an ND filter because we knew we were going to be shooting outside. So I bought all these gear things and started working through the budget I had. And then I was talking with this couple that I had met like my freshman year of college. And they were donors of Cedarville as a university. And they were really nice people. And I was just becoming friends with them because I wanted to be friends with them. Not because I was looking for money. They were actually pretty clear at the beginning of the relationship. We only give money towards engineers and towards engineering scholarships, because that was his thing. He had started a successful engineering company, and so they were like really clear about that. But they were friends with a friend of mine, and so XYZ, we became friends, and I had just, over the course of time, engaged them every time they'd come to campus. Be like, hey, let's sit down and chat. How are the grandkids? How's life? Things like that. And so when it came, they decided to come to campus. They had to come to campus for something. And they were there, and they were like, so what are you up to? What's your next film project? And I'm like, well, actually, it's this film called Blindfolds. And, it's a silent movie about salvation and the salvation process. And they were like, that's super cool. Hey, do you want to go to dinner later tonight and you can tell us more about it? And I was like, sure. And so I went to dinner that night, and they actually ended up buying me dinner. That was nice of them. Normally, I end up doing that as the person trying to get money, and I recommend that. Mm-hmm. Unless they offer, you play that balance, right? Of being respectful to them, but also being respectful to them. I'm just saying, it's a fine line. But basically, they had me talk about the film for a little bit, and they were just like, how much money do you need to make this film happen? And I said, I need $500. And they were like, okay, you'll have it tomorrow morning. And that was a huge blessing, and that was really cool. And it was really a God thing. And I think funding is 99% God and like 1% us.
Yeah, seem about right.
99% God and 1% perspiration, even though it feels like 99% perspiration and 1% God sometimes as a human. It really is a God thing, because although we can say a whole lot of things but you know how it is. Everybody knows this. You have a conversation, and honestly, you remember like nothing of what you actually said.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I could have said something profound, and they might remember it, and I don't. But most likely, I said nothing super important, and they just were already in that mindset because I had built a relationship with them. And so they were already convinced of my why, and it was just moving forward. So, I mean, that's... And the thing is, if I had been doing crowdfunding and they had given that $500 and it had filled in the gaps, it could have happened through crowdfunding. It could have. But that wasn't how God wanted it to happen for that film.
Right.
And so that was donor funded by technicality. And that was really cool. But I think it's a balance because there are times where people pursue something, right? They pursue a film project and it fails in its funding endeavor. And it's because they had a really bad why. They weren't pursuing a good, innovative business model, and they weren't pursuing a good, solid understanding of innovation and engagement, and they were just kind of they're just kind of pursuing. And it's a hard thing to tell someone that, right?
Right.
Because that's sometimes when people come to me. They come to me and they're like, "This failed. How do I get money now?" And I'm like, "Well, I'm sorry that failed. Let's reconsider your why. What questions have you not been asking?" Because that's a very common one. Actually, is that you just targeted the wrong budget, and people kind of laughed at you. People want to know why you're raising the money you are. Man, using why comes back to you and comes back to you. You just use why, and you're like, why? But like, a great example, a fantastic funding executive. She actually has her CFRE, Certified Fundraising Executive. It's basically the doctorate of funding. It means they've raised a ton of money. But I think she's raised $50 million or something. Like, she's made a lot of money. She was the brains behind raising some money for October Baby. She was a funding consultant for that. Anyway, she gave me some advice. She said for me to read a book called If You Give a Mouse a Cookie.
Okay.
It's a children's book. It's an ironic book because this kid basically meets this mouse, and this mouse is like, "Will you give me a cookie?" And he gives this mouse this cookie, and then this mouse asks for a glass of milk, and then a nap, and then and it just keeps on going, and then it cycles back.
Mm-hmm.
And she was like, "It's a great example of funding." And I was like, "What?" And she's like, "Well, it's a really great example of how not to do funding." And I was like, "Okay, you're going to have to explain this." And what it came down to was that she's like, oftentimes people go for a very small amount of money at the beginning. Let's say, everybody else spent $200,000 on their first feature, but you're going to produce it for $25,000 or $20,000. Let's say $20,000. So you raise that through crowdfunding. And let's say you're successful and you convince everybody to go for that, right? And everybody's like super gung-ho and they're like, "Yeah, 20 grand, we're going to produce a movie." Well, then you get done with part of production and you find out, oh wait, we didn't actually raise enough money because production's more expensive than we thought.
Yep.
Right? Not the first time we've heard this one before. Anyway, so they're halfway through, and then they get to post-production. They're like, "Oh, we need to raise more money." Okay, so they raise more money. Then they get to distribution, and they're like, "Oh, we need more money." So they may even raise it for distribution. Then they find out there's marketing dollars with distribution, so it's actually more money. And it's just like, at that time, what happens is you get something called donor fatigue. The same is true for investors, so you get investor fatigue. But like, it's just like you give a mouse a cookie. You give him a cookie, then he wants milk, then he wants a nap. That it's just this coming back policy. That's not how you do business. Because again, investors, donors, they're business people. They expect you to ask for what you want and then give them money back or give them a return on their investment. And they expect you to be able to do it again. So they expect you to be able to say, okay, you've made this feature film. Out of the proceeds of that feature, can you make another one?
Mm-hmm.
And so far, very few Christian filmmakers have been able to do that. And really, independent filmmakers struggle with doing that. The only company that's really been successful in actually, and I say actually successful in doing this, the only company that's really been successful in making a film and then making their next film and making their next film and their next film was Walt Disney Pictures. Disney started from the ground up, and they built a movie, and then they paid for their next one, and they paid for the next one, and they used a business model of paying their own way in making a movie. So they raised enough money to make a high enough quality movie to make money on the next. And that's a successful funding model, is where you're not going back to someone for money.
Yes.
You want them to be coming to you. Really. So, like, you want investors so excited about you that they want to buy into your why. So initially on your first feature, you're gonna have to do some convincing. But after your first feature, definitely after your second feature, they should be so sold on your why that they want to be a part of it. They should be knocking on your door asking. They should be like, when's the next film coming out? The Kendricks are pretty good at that. People ask about them, right? They're like, when's the next Kendrick film going to come out? It's because they've had a successful why. And you can see it within their profit margins. You know, a great example is Facing the Giants. Made like, I think it was $12 million or something on a $500,000 budget.
Something like that.
Yeah, that's a ton of money for like a basic budget. But that being said, they had a convincing why that people believed. And then the next film, they didn't struggle. It wasn't just because of a business success, but they saw that the why actually worked.
Mm-hmm.
And so they were able to get people who were like, yeah, I want to be a part of this. And now they don't have to really work too hard to get crew on their sets because, like, everybody wants to be on a Kendrick's film. Even secular people who don't believe in Jesus, want to be on a Kendrick set because they've heard it's a cool place to be. That's a convincing why. You know, and they can get churches that are just like, yeah, sure, we'll host the entire crew for free. That's a convinced why. And I'm not like, volunteers are a rough, kind of a gray area for a lot of people. The thing about volunteers, and I'm not a big fan of volunteers that are like working long hours. So like I volunteered on a feature film and I worked like 12 to 14 hour days. Not a fan of that. But I think there's something like volunteering houses and things like that. That's often a way that people are able to give that they wouldn't have been able to give otherwise. Because maybe they couldn't have given a monetary gift of $1,000 or something like that, but they can give their large house. Or maybe they didn't even know that they could give $1,000, but they found out they could give their house for 5 people to stay. And so that it's not a completely unreasonable thing. But that's arbitrary.
Yeah, no, those are some good thoughts because I've been in that position before where a project failed and I had to figure out how to go forward from there as well, and it's never easy.
No, it's hard.
So a final question I have for you is, if you had to boil it down, like, what would be the one thing you know now you wish you would have known back when you were first fundraising for projects?
I wish I had known my process. So now I have that 5W idea, right? I can walk through the why, who, what, when, and where. I wish I had known that. But I also wish I had known I wanted to be producer.
Okay.
Because I think I got distracted a lot of times. I think part of that was that I didn't understand that I needed help. And that's like my biggest thing now. That's probably the biggest thing that I wish I knew, was that I needed help. I tried to do a lot of stuff on my own because I couldn't pay people. So I tried to do a lot of it on my own. And normally what would happen was there's a bunch of creatives that wanted to help, but they didn't know till after I had already done it, or they helped me out in the middle, like I totally failed.
Yeah.
And they like made a brief, Facebook message and were like, "Okay, bro, this really stinks. Can you like help?" So I wish I had gone to those people in the first place and asked questions. Because I think I would have had better success that way. Mm-hmm. And with that, planning for that is part of that. So I wish I had planned more for people to be involved and not just me.
Yeah.
And I even struggle with that now as I look to doing some features, right? Yeah. Yes, I'm revealing this. I have a couple of features in the works. But that being said, I have to think about the fact that there are people out there that have the expertise I'm looking for.
Mm-hmm. And
normally it doesn't cost that much money to get their expertise. Free first consultations, like, always free usually.
Yeah.
For the most part. That's just kind of how the world has gone so far. So, like, a free hour-long consultation will blow your mind from a good consultant. Like, whether it's funding, whether it's distribution, script, anything. Like, just finding those people and being vulnerable with them was a huge part, too. Because I tried to hide my stories. And I tried to, like, hold back and be like, well, they don't need to know all of it. The thing is, the more someone knows about your project, the more they're able to help. And so the more advice you can get from other people is just, it will make your project better. Stephen Kendrick once said, I think it was one of the festivals, said, he's like, hold your project out here, out here as in like way away from your heart. Because it's going to get shot at and you don't want to get killed. And that's just stuck. That was like 4 years ago, but it has stuck with me because it is a profound thing. Because your project is going to get shot at. You're going to have people who give their opinions whether you like it or not. Mm-hmm. And it's going to hurt. And really, ask them for the opinion before they get a chance to give it. Because oftentimes, it will soften the blow. Because the only person you can blame is yourself at that point. Because you asked for it. That helps. Just mentally, I think. And then B, be okay with telling them, okay, and I want your brutal opinion. And then brace yourself, sit down, and be prepared to be shot at. But hold your story out here so that it gets shot at and not you. That kind of thing. Yeah, I wish... those are all things that I've kind of learned over the process of years. And... sure, I wish I knew him then, but again, it's all about the process. So, like, you kind of got to live in the process of just it's always going to be refining, always growing, always changing. So,
no, that's really good, and I'm still trying to figure out my process. Like, I got bits and pieces that I know how I like to do it, but other areas I'm still learning what works best for me.
Yeah.
And on that note, we're going to wrap up this episode of the Producer Podcast. So thank you very much for coming on today and helping break down this challenge of fundraising.
No problem.
Thank you all for listening, and make sure to subscribe to the Producer Podcast.